Hey guys, tonight we're not chasing glory. We're not talking about heroes or warriors, or the kind of people history pretends everyone wanted to be. We're talking about survival. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't get statues, doesn't get songs, and doesn't get remembered, but somehow manages to last longer than everything else. Because history, despite what it likes to show you, was not built for comfort. It was loud, unpredictable, and very efficient at ending people who stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. So tonight, we move through worlds that look powerful on the surface, but underneath are held together by something much simpler. Fear, routine, and the constant need to stay alive just one more day. And we begin in ancient Rome. A place where survival had very little to do with strength, and almost everything to do with positioning. Because Rome did not reward effort. It consumed it. Farming broke your body. Soldiering shortened your life. Construction crushed your bones. And if you were unlucky enough to be born without status, you spent most of your time working outdoors under a sun that did not care whether you made it to tomorrow. So the smartest people, the ones who understood the system early, learned something important. You do not win in Rome by being the strongest. You win by being useful in ways that keep you indoors, quiet, and out of reach. That is where the real careers begin. Not the ones carved into monuments, but the ones whispered between households. The ones that existed just close enough to power to benefit from it, but never close enough to be destroyed by it. Because proximity in Rome was everything. If you worked near wealthy households, near officials, near systems that mattered, your chances improved. Not because anyone respected you, but because someone needed you. And being needed, quietly and consistently, was the closest thing Rome had to safety. Now this is where things start to become interesting. Because the safest jobs were rarely the most honorable. In fact, they were often the opposite. They existed in that uncomfortable space where morality became flexible, and usefulness became absolute. You were not there to question. You were there to function. Take, for example, the kind of person who organized private gatherings for the elite. Not a guest, not a participant, but the one who ensured everything happened exactly as it should. Guest lists controlled carefully. Timing managed precisely. People separated when necessary. Because in a city where reputation could collapse faster than a building fire, the wrong encounter in the wrong room could end a career overnight. Your role was not pleasure. Your role was control. You managed risk, not experience. And if you did your job well, no one noticed you at all. That was always the goal. Invisibility. The same logic applied across dozens of professions. The scribe who wrote letters for men who could not afford to sound foolish. The attendant who worked in bathhouses, hearing everything while being acknowledged by no one. The quiet intermediary who arranged meetings, handled introductions, or smoothed over problems before they became visible. These people did not shape history in obvious ways, but they survived it, which, in Rome, was far more impressive. And survival, more often than not, came down to one simple advantage. Being indoors. It sounds almost ridiculous, but in a world where weather, war, and labor killed without hesitation, a roof over your head during working hours was a form of protection. Shade in the summer. Warmth in the winter. Walls between you and chaos. Because outside was where things went wrong. Outside was where bodies wore down, where accidents happened, where soldiers marched and didn't return. Inside, life slowed just enough to be manageable. But even inside, safety was never guaranteed. It was negotiated. Carefully. Constantly. Through silence, through discretion, and through understanding one very important rule. You could know everything, but you could never say everything. And that rule does not disappear when Rome fades. It simply changes form. Because when we move forward into medieval courts, into stone castles and shadowed corridors, survival looks different, but it feels exactly the same. Power becomes quieter. More controlled. More symbolic. And nowhere is that more visible than in the life of a queen who has just lost her king. Because the moment a king dies, everything changes. Not just politically, but personally, structurally, visibly. A queen does not simply become a widow. She becomes a symbol. Her grief is no longer her own. It belongs to the court, the church, and every watching eye waiting to interpret what her next move means. And just like in Rome, the safest position is not the strongest one. It is the most controlled one. Her clothing changes first. Color disappears. Fabric darkens. Weight increases. Not for comfort, but for visibility. Grief must be seen. Measured. Understood without words. Every step she takes is observed. Every expression analyzed. Too much sorrow suggests instability. Too little suggests ambition. And ambition, at the wrong time, is dangerous. So she learns the same lesson, in a different world. Control what is visible. Hide what is not. Become smaller, quieter, harder to read. Because survival, even at the highest levels of power, is still survival. And if Rome taught people how to stay alive through usefulness, medieval courts perfected something else. Survival through performance. Because here, even grief has rules. And just like that, without anyone saying it out loud, we begin to see the pattern forming. Different worlds. Different systems. Same outcome. The people who last the longest are not the loudest. Not the strongest. Not the most admired. They are the ones who understand where they are standing, who is watching them. And exactly how much of themselves they can afford to reveal. And that pattern doesn't stop there. It stretches further back, into places even older, where survival wasn't written in laws or titles, but in something far less visible. Ritual. Because long before systems were organized, people were already trying to control what they could not understand. Illness. Weather. Death. Luck. All the unpredictable parts of life that made survival feel uncertain. And so they created rules. Not written rules. Lived ones. Do this, and things will go well. Avoid that, and danger might pass you by. Repeat this action, speak these words, follow this pattern, and maybe, just maybe, tomorrow will look the same as today. Rituals were not about belief alone. They were about control. Or at least the illusion of it. And that illusion was powerful enough to shape entire societies. Because when people agree on what must be done, even if they don't fully understand why, behavior becomes predictable. Order begins to form. And in a world where chaos is always one step away, predictability feels like safety. But rituals also come with boundaries. Lines you do not cross. Actions you do not take. Words you do not say. Taboos. And taboos, more than anything else, reveal what a society fears the most. Not what it celebrates, not what it values publicly, but what it quietly avoids. What it protects itself from, even without explanation. Because breaking a taboo was never just about the act itself. It was about disrupting the system that kept everyone feeling safe. And in that way, rituals and taboos functioned exactly like the quiet jobs in Rome, or the controlled grief of a mourning queen. They were structures designed to reduce risk. To manage uncertainty. To keep people within boundaries that increased their chances of survival. And occasionally, someone stepped outside those boundaries entirely. Not by accident, but by intention. Which brings us, slowly, almost inevitably, to a woman who did exactly that. Zenobia. Because while most people in history survived by staying quiet, staying useful, and staying within the system, Zenobia did something far more dangerous. She stepped into power. Not inherited quietly. Not protected carefully. Claimed. And in doing so, she broke nearly every rule that had kept others safe. But even then, even at that level, even with armies and authority and ambition, survival was still the same game. Just played at a higher risk. Because power does not remove danger. It magnifies it. And the same rules apply. Know when to speak. Know when to act. Know when to hold back. And most importantly, understand that every move is being watched, measured, and remembered. Because history does not forgive mistakes easily. It simply records who survived them. And as we move through these worlds, from Rome to royal courts to ancient rituals and rising empires, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Survival was never about being extraordinary. It was about being careful. Careful with your words. Careful with your position. Careful with what you revealed, and what you kept hidden. Because in the end, the people who lived the longest were not the ones who changed the world loudly. They were the ones who understood it quietly. And that adjustment, that quiet calibration between what you are and what the world expects you to be, becomes the most valuable skill a person can develop, no matter the century, no matter the empire, no matter how different the surface appears. Because once you begin to notice it, you realize it was never just about Rome, or queens, or rituals, or even power. It was always about pressure. The kind that shapes behavior slowly, consistently, until it becomes instinct. Back in ancient Rome, that instinct showed itself early. You learned where to stand, when to speak, and most importantly, when not to. You learned how to exist in rooms where you technically did not belong. And yet were necessary enough to remain. A scribe, for example, did not simply write words. He translated emotion into something acceptable. Anger became formality. Desire became poetry. Threats became carefully structured sentences that could be denied if needed. That was the job. Not honesty, but control. And control, in Rome, was always more valuable than truth. Because truth could be dangerous. Truth could offend. Truth could expose. But controlled language, measured and deliberate, allowed powerful people to communicate without risk. And the person who provided that service became quietly indispensable. Not visible. Not celebrated. But protected. Protection, again, being the real goal. The same pattern appeared in places that looked far less refined. Bathhouses, for instance, which on the surface were chaotic spaces. Steam, voices, movement, bodies everywhere. But underneath that noise was structure. Attendants who managed temperature, timing, access. Individuals who knew exactly how far to step into a conversation and when to step out of it. People who heard everything and repeated nothing. Because information, like everything else in Rome, was currency. And the safest way to hold currency was not to spend it. So you listened. You observed. You stored details without reacting to them. Not because you were indifferent, but because reacting created risk. And risk, if you were paying attention, was the one thing everyone else seemed to underestimate. That's what separated the survivors from everyone else. Not strength. Not intelligence alone. Awareness. Awareness of how quickly things could change. A patron falls out of favor. A political shift happens overnight. A rumor spreads, and suddenly the room you worked in yesterday is no longer safe today. And if you were too visible, too connected, too involved, you fell with it. But if you stayed just outside that circle, useful but not central, present but not memorable, you had a chance to step away before the collapse reached you. That was the balance. Close enough to benefit. Distant enough to escape. And it wasn't always comfortable. It wasn't meant to be. Survival rarely is. It required restraint. The kind that most people struggle with. The ability to hear something important and not react. To see an opportunity and not take it immediately. To understand that sometimes, doing less was the smartest decision available. Because in Rome, action drew attention. And attention was unpredictable. Now shift forward, and the setting changes, but the rules remain. Stone replaces marble. Silence replaces noise. The open unpredictability of Rome gives way to the controlled stillness of a medieval court. But underneath, the same system is operating. Pressure. Observation. Adjustment. A queen in mourning does not have the freedom to react naturally. She cannot express grief the way an ordinary person might. Her sorrow is measured. Timed. Observed from every angle. Not because people are cruel, but because her grief carries meaning beyond herself. It signals stability. Or instability. Loyalty. Or ambition. And in a court where alliances shift as easily as conversation, those signals matter. So she learns quickly. Or she does not last long enough for it to matter. Her movements slow. Her presence becomes deliberate. Even stillness becomes a form of communication. A pause held slightly longer than expected. A glance lowered at exactly the right moment. Hands kept steady, even when the weight of expectation presses down harder than any physical burden ever could. Because here, just like in Rome, visibility is dangerous if it is not controlled. Too visible, and you invite scrutiny. Too hidden, and you invite suspicion. So you exist in between. Carefully. And that space, that narrow space between being seen and being safe, is where survival happens. It's where influence quietly grows, even when it appears to disappear. Because absence, used correctly, creates curiosity. Silence, used correctly, creates authority. And a queen who understands that does not need to raise her voice to maintain power. She simply needs to control when she is present, and when she is not. The same principle appears again, in places that seem completely unrelated. Ancient rituals, for example, where survival is not tied to politics or profession, but to belief. Or more accurately, to shared behavior that reinforces belief. Because rituals are rarely about the action itself. They are about repetition. Consistency. The reassurance that if something worked before, it might work again. And in a world where disease arrives without warning, where harvests fail without explanation, where death can come quietly or violently without reason, that reassurance becomes essential. So people repeat actions. They follow patterns. They create systems of behavior that reduce uncertainty, even if only psychologically. And over time, those systems become rules. Not written, but understood. Do not cross this line. Do not speak this word. Do not break this pattern. Because if you do, something might go wrong. And no one wants to be responsible for that. So compliance becomes instinct. Not out of fear alone, but out of collective agreement. Because if everyone follows the same rules, the world feels slightly more stable. And stability, even if it is an illusion, is enough to keep people functioning. But what makes rituals truly powerful is not what they demand you do. It's what they prevent you from doing. Because limitation creates structure. And structure creates predictability. And predictability, once again, feels like safety. Which is why breaking a taboo feels so significant, even when the action itself seems small. It's not the act. It's the disruption. The moment where the system hesitates, even briefly, because something has happened that it cannot immediately explain or contain. And that hesitation is dangerous. Because uncertainty spreads quickly. Faster than logic. Faster than reassurance. And once it spreads, people begin to question. Not just the rule, but the system behind it. Which is why most people never break those rules. Not because they cannot, but because they understand the cost. Even if they cannot fully articulate it. And then, occasionally, someone appears who is willing to take that risk anyway. Not accidentally. Deliberately. Which brings us back, again, to Zenobia. Because what makes her story stand out is not just that she gained power. It's how she approached it. Carefully, at first. Measured. Observant. She understood the system she was operating within. The expectations placed on her. The limitations that existed, not because they were logical, but because they were accepted. And she worked within those boundaries long enough to understand them completely. That was the key. Because you cannot move beyond a system until you understand how it holds itself together. And once you do, once you see the structure clearly, you begin to notice where it is strong. And where it is not. Where it depends on perception. Where it depends on agreement. Where it can be influenced without being directly confronted. And that is where real power begins. Not in force. But in awareness. The same awareness that kept a Roman scribe alive. The same awareness that allowed a mourning queen to maintain control without appearing to seek it. The same awareness that kept entire societies functioning through rituals that no one fully questioned. Zenobia did not ignore these systems. She studied them. And then, slowly, she began to shift them. Not loudly. Not recklessly. But deliberately. Because survival, even at the level of rulers, still follows the same rules. Understand the environment. Control what is visible. Limit what can be used against you. And move only when the moment allows it. Because timing, more than strength, determines outcome. Always. And if you look closely, if you step back from the details and watch the pattern instead, you begin to see that history is not a series of dramatic moments. It's a series of adjustments. Small decisions made under pressure. Repeated over and over again. Until they either keep someone alive. Or they don't. And the people who last, the ones who navigate these systems successfully, are rarely the ones making the most noise. They are the ones paying attention. Quietly. Constantly. Because in the end, survival is not about changing the world. It's about understanding it well enough to move through it without being destroyed by it. And that understanding, once learned, never really disappears. It just adapts. To different places. Different systems. Different expectations. But always the same goal. Stay needed. Stay unnoticed. Stay alive. And staying alive, once you understand it that way, stops feeling like a dramatic victory and starts looking more like a series of quiet decisions made correctly, over and over again, often without anyone noticing, often without anyone remembering. Because survival rarely announces itself. It simply continues. And in that continuation, patterns deepen. Back in ancient Rome, those patterns became almost instinctive for the people who lasted long enough to recognize them. You could see it in the way they moved through space. Not hurried, not careless, but deliberate. A person who survived Rome did not rush unless rushing was necessary. They did not speak unless speaking was useful. And they never forgot who was watching, even when it appeared that no one was. Because someone was always watching. A patron evaluating usefulness. A rival noticing proximity. A servant overhearing something that might later become important. Information moved quietly, but it moved constantly. And once something was said, it could not be unsaid. Once something was seen, it could not be unseen. So restraint became habit. Not because people lacked thoughts or opinions, but because expressing them freely carried a cost that was rarely worth paying. And over time, that restraint created a kind of internal discipline. A way of filtering actions before they happened, rather than reacting to consequences afterward. That was the difference. Reaction was dangerous. Anticipation was survival. And the people who mastered anticipation did not just live longer. They lived more comfortably. Not comfortably in the modern sense, but comfortably within the limits of their world. They knew where they stood. They knew how far they could go. And they knew when to stop. Stopping, in fact, was one of the most underrated skills in any historical setting. Knowing when enough had been done. Knowing when continuing would draw attention. Knowing when success itself was becoming visible enough to be risky. Because visibility, once again, was a double-edged condition. It brought opportunity, but it also brought scrutiny. And scrutiny, if sustained long enough, almost always found something to question. So the smartest individuals learned to step back before they were pushed back. To reduce their presence just enough to remain useful, but not enough to become indispensable in a way that made others uncomfortable. Because there is a threshold. A point where usefulness becomes dependency. And dependency, especially among the powerful, can quickly turn into resentment. So balance had to be maintained. Always. And this balance was not taught formally. It was observed. Absorbed. Learned through watching others succeed and fail. Through noticing which names continued to appear, quietly, over time, and which ones vanished suddenly without explanation. Because disappearance, in history, is rarely random. It is usually the result of a miscalculation. A moment where someone spoke too freely, acted too quickly, trusted too easily, or simply misread the room they were in. And rooms, whether in Rome or in medieval courts, were never just physical spaces. They were environments filled with expectations, hierarchies, and unspoken rules that shifted depending on who was present. Which is why adaptability mattered. Not just knowing one set of rules, but recognizing when those rules had changed. Because they always did. A new ruler. A new alliance. A shift in power that rippled outward, altering behavior in ways that were not immediately obvious but quickly became necessary to follow. And those who noticed early adjusted early. Those who did not often found themselves reacting too late. Now, if you move again, into the quieter, more controlled world of medieval courts, that same pattern becomes even more refined. Because here, change is slower on the surface, but deeper underneath. A mourning queen, for instance, exists within a structure that appears rigid. Fixed rituals. Established expectations. Defined roles. But within that structure, subtle shifts are constantly occurring. Who is allowed access? Who speaks on her behalf? Who interprets her silence? These details matter more than any public display. Because influence, in this environment, rarely announces itself directly. It moves through proximity. Through trust. Through repetition. A familiar presence becomes a trusted one. A trusted one becomes a necessary one. And a necessary one, over time, gains the ability to shape outcomes without appearing to do so. And that is where real power often resides. Not in commands, but in guidance. Not in visibility, but in consistency. A queen who understands this does not need to assert control openly. She allows others to act, but within boundaries she has quietly influenced. She listens more than she speaks. Observes more than she reacts. And in doing so, gathers a clearer understanding of the environment than those who are constantly trying to shape it directly. Because direct control invites resistance. Indirect influence avoids it. And again, this is not unique to courts or crowns. It appears in rituals as well. In the way communities enforce behavior without needing constant enforcement. Because once a pattern is accepted, it reinforces itself. People follow it not because they are forced to, but because it feels correct. Familiar. Safe. And that feeling is powerful enough to maintain order without visible authority. Which is why rituals persist. Even when their original purpose is forgotten. Even when the logic behind them fades. Because the behavior remains. And behavior, once established, becomes difficult to change. Not impossible. But costly. Because changing behavior requires breaking patterns. And breaking patterns creates uncertainty. And uncertainty, as always, feels dangerous. So most people avoid it. They remain within the system. They follow the structure. They adjust slightly when needed, but rarely challenge the foundation itself. Which is why individuals like Zenobia stand out so clearly. Not because they ignored structure, but because they understood it well enough to move beyond it. Carefully. Strategically. She did not begin by breaking expectations. She began by meeting them. Fulfilling roles. Establishing credibility. Building a position that could not easily be dismissed. Because stepping outside a system without first being accepted within it is rarely successful. It creates resistance immediately. But stepping outside after being accepted creates something different. Confusion. Delay. A moment where others are not entirely sure how to respond. And in that moment, space appears. Space to act. Space to redefine expectations. Space to shift perception. And perception, in any structured environment, is one of the most powerful tools available. Because people do not respond only to actions. They respond to what they believe those actions mean. So if perception can be guided, outcomes can often be influenced without direct confrontation. That is the advantage of awareness applied at a higher level. The same awareness that allowed a Roman worker to remain unnoticed. The same awareness that allowed a queen to maintain authority through silence. Now used to reshape an entire system. But even then, even at that level, the risks do not disappear. They increase. Because the more influence you gain, the more attention you attract. And attention, once again, introduces unpredictability. Opposition forms. Expectations rise. Mistakes become more visible. And the margin for error becomes smaller. Much smaller. Which is why even the most capable individuals must eventually confront the same reality as everyone else. That survival is never guaranteed. It is only managed. For a time. Through decisions. Through restraint. Through awareness. And through the constant, often exhausting effort of staying aligned with an environment that is always shifting, always watching, always ready to respond. And when that alignment breaks, whether through ambition, miscalculation, or simple change beyond one's control, the system reacts. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes immediately. But always in a way that restores its balance. Because systems, whether empires, courts, or cultures, are designed to continue. Not to accommodate individuals. And that is perhaps the most important thing to understand. That no matter how skilled, how careful, or how aware someone becomes, they are still operating within something larger than themselves. Something that cannot be fully controlled. Only navigated. And navigation, at its core, is not about forcing direction. It is about recognizing currents. Moving with them when possible. Avoiding them when necessary. And knowing, at all times, where you are in relation to them. Because losing that awareness, even briefly, is often enough. Enough to shift position. Enough to draw attention. Enough to change outcomes in ways that cannot easily be reversed. So the people who lasted, across all these worlds, shared something subtle but consistent. They remained aware. Not occasionally. Not when it was convenient. But constantly. A quiet, ongoing observation of everything around them. People. Patterns. Shifts. Silences. Because silence, as it turns out, often says more than words ever could. And the ability to hear it, to understand what is not being said, to recognize absence as much as presence, becomes one of the most reliable indicators of what is about to happen next. And that, more than anything else, is what allowed them to continue. Not indefinitely. No one does. But longer than most. And in history, longer than most is often the closest thing to success that ever truly existed. And once you begin to see it that way, success stops looking like victory and starts looking like duration, measured not in moments of triumph, but in how long someone manages to remain within the system without being removed by it. Because removal, whether sudden or gradual, is always waiting in the background, not as a threat that is constantly announced, but as a possibility that is always present. In ancient Rome, that possibility shaped behavior in ways that became almost invisible over time. People did not wake up each morning thinking about danger directly. They did not narrate their caution or analyze every step consciously. Instead, they moved through routines that had been refined by experience, by observation, and by the quiet understanding that certain actions led to stability while others led to complications that were rarely worth the risk. So routines became protective. Not rigid, but reliable. A scribe arrived at the same place each day, sat in the same position, used the same tools, spoke in the same measured tone. Not because variation was impossible, but because consistency reduced attention. And reduced attention meant fewer questions, fewer interruptions, fewer chances for something unexpected to disrupt the pattern. And patterns, once established, create a kind of predictability that others begin to depend on. Dependence, in turn, creates a subtle form of protection. Because removing something predictable creates instability. And instability, especially in structured environments, is avoided whenever possible. So the individual who maintains consistency becomes part of the system itself. Not central. Not irreplaceable. But integrated. And integration, more than visibility or recognition, is what keeps someone in place over time. You see the same principle again in quieter roles, the ones that never appear in dramatic accounts of history but exist in every functioning society. The person who manages access, who controls small but essential processes, who ensures that things happen when and where they should. These roles do not command attention, but they influence flow. And influencing flow, even at a small scale, shapes outcomes in ways that are rarely acknowledged but often felt. Because disruption is noticeable. Smooth function is not. And the people who maintain that smooth function are often the last to be removed, simply because their absence is more disruptive than their presence ever was. Now move again, into the controlled environment of a medieval court, and the same idea takes on a different form. A queen in mourning becomes part of a ritual pattern that the court expects to see. Her presence, her absence, her clothing, her silence, all follow a structure that has been repeated enough times to feel necessary. And once that structure is in place, deviation from it becomes more noticeable than the structure itself. So she maintains it. Not because it reflects her internal state perfectly, but because it stabilizes the external environment. Her stillness reassures others. Her restraint reduces speculation. Her consistency allows the court to continue functioning without interruption. And in that sense, her role becomes less about personal expression and more about maintaining continuity. Because continuity is what prevents uncertainty from spreading. And uncertainty, once it begins, is difficult to contain. It moves through conversations, through interpretations, through small shifts in behavior that accumulate until the system itself begins to feel unstable. So stability is protected. Not just through laws or authority, but through repetition. Through visible patterns that reassure everyone involved that things are proceeding as expected. And again, the individuals who understand this are the ones who last the longest. Because they do not challenge the pattern directly. They work within it. They maintain it when necessary. And when they do change something, they do so gradually, in ways that do not immediately disrupt the larger structure. Because sudden change invites reaction. Gradual change often goes unnoticed until it has already taken effect. This is where awareness becomes more than observation. It becomes timing. Knowing not just what to do, but when to do it. Because the same action, taken at the wrong moment, can create resistance. Taken at the right moment, it can pass without conflict. And timing, unlike strength or status, is not visible. It cannot be measured directly. But it can be sensed. By those who are paying attention. And this applies just as much to rituals as it does to courts or cities. Because rituals, at their core, are about maintaining a sense of order through repetition. And repetition creates rhythm. A predictable sequence of actions that give structure to time itself. When something disrupts that rhythm, even slightly, it is noticed. Not always consciously, but enough to create a sense that something is different. And that difference, depending on context, can either be absorbed or resisted. Which is why most rituals remain consistent over long periods. Not because they cannot change, but because stability within them reduces the need for explanation. An explanation, especially in environments where knowledge is limited or uncertain, often creates more questions than answers. So continuity is preferred. Even when the original purpose is no longer fully understood. Because the behavior itself has become enough. Enough to maintain order. Enough to reduce uncertainty. Enough to keep the system functioning. And once again, the individuals who move most effectively within these systems are the ones who recognize this. Who understand that structure is not something to be ignored, but something to be navigated carefully. Because structure resists sudden force. But it adapts to gradual pressure. And that is where individuals like Zenobia begin to operate differently. Because by the time she moves beyond expectation, she has already spent enough time within it to understand its limits. She knows what is accepted, what is expected, what is ignored, and most importantly, what has not been tested. Because untested areas are where change becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. And possibility, in a structured environment, is often the only opening that exists. So she moves into that space. Carefully. Without announcing it immediately. Without drawing attention too early. Because early attention invites early resistance. And resistance, once established, is difficult to overcome. So the shift begins subtly. Decisions that align with expectation, but extend slightly beyond it. Actions that appear consistent with existing roles, but introduce new outcomes. Enough to change direction. Not enough to trigger immediate opposition. And over time, those small shifts accumulate. They begin to redefine what is considered normal. What is accepted. What is expected. Until eventually, the system itself adjusts. Not because it was forced to, but because it was guided. And guidance, when done effectively, feels natural. Almost inevitable. As if things could not have unfolded any other way. But even then, even at that level of control, the balance remains fragile. Because systems tolerate change up to a point. And beyond that point, they begin to respond. Not always immediately. Not always visibly. But consistently. Because the larger the shift, the greater the need for the system to reassert stability. And that is where the limits of individual influence become clear. Because no matter how skilled, how aware, or how precise someone is, they are still operating within something that exists beyond them. Something that will continue, with or without them. And that reality shapes the final stage of survival. Not just staying within the system. Not just influencing it. But recognizing when it is no longer aligned with you. Because alignment, once lost, creates friction. And friction, over time, becomes unsustainable. So the final skill, the one that is rarely spoken about but consistently observed, is the ability to recognize when to withdraw. Not in defeat. But in preservation. Because leaving at the right moment often preserves more than staying too long. And staying too long, in history, has ended more lives than leaving ever has. But leaving requires clarity. The ability to see the shift before it becomes obvious. To recognize that the environment has changed, even if it still looks the same on the surface. Because surface appearances are often the last thing to change. Underneath, movement begins earlier. Quieter. Less visible. But just as real. And those who notice it early have options. Those who notice it late often do not. So awareness returns again, at every level, in every setting, across every system. Not as a single skill, but as a continuous process. Watching. Listening. Adjusting. Remaining present enough to understand what is happening, but distant enough not to be consumed by it. Because being consumed, whether by ambition, by emotion, or by circumstance, removes the ability to adapt. And adaptation, more than anything else, is what determines duration. Not perfection. Not control. But the ability to respond correctly as conditions change. And conditions always change. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes all at once. But never in a way that allows complete stability to last forever. Which brings everything back to the same quiet conclusion. That across empires, courts, beliefs, and individuals, the difference between those who last and those who do not is rarely dramatic. It is subtle. A series of small, correct decisions made under pressure. Repeated consistently. Without recognition. Without celebration. But with results that speak for themselves. Because in the end, survival was never about standing out. It was about understanding where you were, what was expected, and how to move within that space without creating unnecessary risk. And doing that. Again and again. Until, almost without realizing it, you have outlasted most of what once surrounded you. And in history, that quiet endurance, more than anything else, is what remains. And what remains, more often than not, is not the moment itself, but the pattern it leaves behind. Because history does not preserve everything equally. It remembers disruption. It records collapse. It celebrates extremes. But the quiet continuity in between, the long stretches where nothing appears to happen, are where most people actually lived. And within those stretches, survival was not dramatic. It was repetitive. A series of days that looked similar enough to feel stable, but different enough to require attention. Because even in repetition, nothing was ever completely the same. Back in ancient Rome, a familiar street could feel different depending on who was present. A routine task could carry new risk depending on recent events. A conversation that seemed harmless one day could become significant the next, simply because the context around it had shifted. And context, more than action, often determined outcome. The same words, spoken in a different moment, could have entirely different consequences. The same behavior, observed by different people, could be interpreted in ways that changed everything that followed. So awareness had to extend beyond action. It had to include timing, environment, and perception. Because perception shaped response. And response shaped reality. Which is why those who survived did not rely on fixed strategies alone. They adapted continuously, adjusting not just what they did, but how they did it, and when. They learned to read rooms before speaking. To observe reactions before committing. To recognize tension before it became visible. Because visible tension was already late. By the time something could be clearly seen, it had already begun. Quietly. Underneath. And that understanding created a different kind of patience. Not passive waiting, but active observation. A willingness to delay action until the moment was clearer. Because acting too early often created problems that did not need to exist. And acting too late removed options entirely. So the space in between, that narrow window where action was both possible and effective, became the most valuable place to operate. And finding that space required attention. Consistent, careful attention to everything that seemed small enough to ignore. Because small details, repeated over time, reveal patterns. And patterns, once recognized, allow prediction. Not perfect prediction. But enough to reduce uncertainty. Enough to prepare. Enough to respond with intention instead of reaction. And that difference, subtle as it may seem, is what separates those who navigate systems successfully from those who are shaped by them without realizing it. Because being shaped by a system means responding after something happens. Navigating a system means adjusting before it does. And that distinction appears everywhere. In Rome, in courts, in rituals, and in the lives of individuals who moved through all of them. A letter writer, for instance, did not simply record what was said. He anticipated how it would be received. He adjusted tone, structure, and language to align with expectations that were not always spoken, but always present. A mourning queen did not simply express grief. She presented it in a way that maintained stability, avoided suspicion, and aligned with traditions that extended far beyond her personal experience. A community following ritual did not question every action. It repeated what had been done before, trusting that consistency would preserve order, even when understanding was incomplete. And someone like Zenobia did not step outside these patterns immediately. She learned them first. Understood them. Used them. Because stepping outside a system without understanding it creates conflict. Stepping outside it after understanding creates possibility. And possibility, when handled carefully, becomes influence. But influence, once again, brings attention. And attention changes everything. Because once attention is focused, actions are no longer interpreted casually. They are examined, compared, questioned. And the margin for error narrows significantly. So the same awareness that allowed someone to rise must also adapt to allow them to remain. Because rising and remaining are not the same process. Rising often involves movement, change, and opportunity. Remaining involves stability, restraint, and control. And many individuals throughout history managed the first. Fewer managed the second. Because maintaining position requires a different kind of discipline. The discipline to not overextend. To not assume permanence. To not mistake current stability for guaranteed future security. Because nothing in these systems is guaranteed. Not position. Not protection. Not even relevance. Everything is conditional. Dependent on alignment with the environment at a given moment. And when that alignment shifts, everything built upon it becomes unstable. Which is why the most consistent survivors did not attach themselves too tightly to any single position. They remained flexible. Not in identity, but in approach. Willing to adjust. Willing to step back. Willing to move when movement became necessary. Because staying still in a changing environment often creates more risk than movement does. But movement itself had to be controlled. Directed. Timed. Because unnecessary movement creates attention. And attention, as always, introduces unpredictability. So even change had to be measured. Carefully introduced. Gradually expanded. Until it felt natural enough to be accepted. And once accepted, it became part of the system itself. Reinforcing it. Stabilizing it. Until, eventually, it was no longer seen as change at all. Just the way things were. And that is how systems evolve. Not through sudden transformation, but through accumulated adjustments that reshape behavior over time. And within that process, individuals either adapt or are replaced. Not always immediately. Not always visibly. But inevitably. Because systems prioritize continuation. And continuation requires stability. Even if that stability is constantly being adjusted beneath the surface. So the people who lasted, across all these environments, shared something that does not appear dramatic, but proves essential. They remained attentive to change, even when everything appeared stable. They questioned assumptions quietly, without challenging them openly. They adjusted behavior before it became necessary, rather than waiting until it was required. And in doing so, they maintained alignment with systems that were always moving, even when they seemed still. Because stillness, in history, is often an illusion. A surface condition that hides ongoing change beneath it. And recognizing that illusion is what allows someone to navigate it effectively. Because once you understand that nothing is truly fixed, that every structure is maintained through continuous reinforcement, you begin to see where that reinforcement is strongest. And where it is not. And those points, those subtle areas where stability depends on repetition rather than strength, are where change becomes possible. Not easy. Not immediate. But possible. And possibility, once recognized, becomes a factor in every decision. Not as a constant pursuit, but as an awareness that things could be different under the right conditions. Which returns everything, once again, to awareness. Not as a single moment of realization, but as an ongoing process. A way of moving through the world that prioritizes observation over reaction, understanding over assumption, and timing over impulse. Because impulse, while sometimes effective, often creates outcomes that cannot be easily controlled. And control, even in small amounts, is what allows someone to remain within a system long enough to benefit from it. So control becomes selective. Focused not on everything, but on what matters most. What is said. What is shown. What is withheld. Because what is withheld is often as important as what is revealed. Sometimes more so. And knowing that difference, understanding what to share and what to keep, becomes another quiet skill that defines long-term survival. Because information, once released, cannot be reclaimed. But information held can be used. Later. When timing allows. When context supports it. When outcome becomes more predictable. And that patience, that willingness to wait for the right moment, appears again and again in the lives of those who navigated complex systems successfully. Not waiting out of fear. But waiting out of strategy. Because action without preparation creates exposure. Preparation without action creates stagnation. And the balance between the two is where effective movement occurs. Always. Across every setting. Across every time period. Across every individual who understood that survival was not about avoiding risk entirely, but about managing it carefully. Reducing it where possible. Accepting it where necessary. And never ignoring it. Because ignored risk does not disappear. It accumulates. Quietly. Until it becomes unavoidable. And at that point, response is no longer optional. It is required. Often urgently. Often without the benefit of preparation. And those moments, the ones where preparation has not kept pace with change, are where outcomes become unpredictable. Which is why preparation, even when nothing appears to be happening, remains essential. Because nothing appearing to happen does not mean nothing is happening. It simply means it has not become visible yet. And visibility, once again, arrives late. After patterns have already begun to shift. After decisions have already been made. After consequences have already started to form. So the individuals who remained attentive to the invisible stages, the early signals, the subtle changes, were the ones who maintained the greatest degree of control over their outcomes. Not complete control. That does not exist. But enough. Enough to adjust. Enough to respond. Enough to continue. And continuation, in the end, was always the goal. Not perfection. Not dominance. Not recognition. Just continuation. One day to the next. One decision to the next. One adjustment to the next. Until, gradually, without spectacle, without announcement, survival turns into something more. Not because it was intended to. But because it lasted long enough to become significant. And in history, significance is often nothing more than survival observed from a distance. And when survival is observed from a distance, it begins to look intentional, almost strategic in a way that feels planned from the beginning, even though, in reality, it was built piece by piece, decision by decision, often without the certainty that it would lead anywhere at all. Because most people living through these systems were not thinking in terms of legacy. They were thinking in terms of continuity. Getting through the day without creating problems that could not be solved. Maintaining position without attracting unnecessary attention. Preserving stability in environments where stability was never guaranteed. And that difference matters. Because when you remove the idea of legacy, what remains is behavior that is far more grounded, far more practical, and far more revealing of how systems actually function. Back in ancient Rome, this behavior could be seen in the smallest details. The way someone entered a room. The way they greeted others. The order in which they spoke, or chose not to. None of it was random. None of it was careless. It was shaped by an understanding, sometimes conscious, sometimes instinctive, that every interaction carried potential consequences. Not always immediate. But cumulative. Because consequences in structured environments rarely appear all at once. They build gradually, through repeated impressions, through patterns of behavior that others begin to recognize and respond to over time. A single misstep might be overlooked. Repeated missteps become a reputation. And reputation, once established, begins to influence outcomes before any new action is even taken. So consistency becomes protection. Not perfect consistency, but controlled consistency. Enough to create predictability. Enough to reduce uncertainty in how others perceive you. Because perception, once again, shapes response. And response shapes opportunity. Which is why individuals who understood this did not simply act based on their own intentions. They acted with an awareness of how those actions would be interpreted. They adjusted tone, timing, and presence to align with expectations that were not always stated, but always present. And in doing so, they reduced friction. They avoided unnecessary conflict. They created conditions where their presence was accepted, even if it was not actively welcomed. And acceptance, in most cases, was enough. Because being accepted meant being allowed to remain. And remaining, over time, created opportunities that were not available to those who were removed early. Now shift again, into the more controlled environment of a medieval court, and that same principle becomes even more visible, particularly in the life of a mourning queen. Because her entire existence during that period is defined by perception. Not just what she does, but what her actions are understood to mean. Her silence can be interpreted as grief, or as calculation. Her presence can be seen as loyalty, or as ambition. And the difference between those interpretations does not always depend on her intention. It depends on the observer. Which means she cannot control meaning directly. She can only guide it. Through consistency. Through repetition. Through careful alignment with expectations that reduce the likelihood of misinterpretation. And over time, that guidance becomes influence. Because when people begin to expect certain behavior, they also begin to interpret it in predictable ways. And predictable interpretation reduces uncertainty. Which reduces suspicion. Which increases stability. And stability, once again, becomes the goal. Not because it eliminates risk, but because it manages it. Because unmanaged risk spreads. It creates questions. It introduces doubt. And doubt, in structured environments, often leads to scrutiny. Which is why stability is reinforced continuously. Not through force alone, but through behavior that aligns with what others expect to see. And that alignment, repeated consistently, becomes a form of communication. A way of signaling that everything is under control, even when it may not be entirely so. Because control, in many cases, is less about actual conditions and more about perceived conditions. If things appear stable, they are often treated as stable. And that treatment reinforces the appearance. Creating a cycle. A feedback loop where perception and reality begin to align, even if only temporarily. The same pattern appears again in rituals and taboos. Because rituals create visible stability. They provide structure that people can rely on, even when the underlying reality remains uncertain. And taboos reinforce that structure by defining boundaries that should not be crossed. Not always because of clear consequences, but because crossing them introduces unpredictability. And unpredictability, as always, is what people seek to avoid. So behavior becomes guided. Not just by logic, but by tradition. By repetition. By a shared understanding that certain actions maintain order, while others disrupt it. And that understanding, even when it is not fully explained, becomes powerful enough to shape entire societies. Because when enough people follow the same patterns, those patterns become self-sustaining. They no longer require constant enforcement. They continue because they feel correct. Because they have always been done that way. And changing them requires effort that most people are not willing to invest, especially when the existing system, while imperfect, still functions. Which is why change, when it does occur, often comes from individuals who are willing to operate at the edges of these systems. Not entirely outside them. But not fully constrained by them either. And that brings us, once again, to Zenobia. Because her position allows her to see both the structure and its limitations. She understands the expectations placed upon her. The roles she is meant to fulfill. The boundaries she is not meant to cross. And instead of rejecting those boundaries immediately, she works within them long enough to understand how they are maintained. Where they are reinforced. Where they are assumed. And where they are fragile. Because every system, no matter how stable it appears, has points of weakness. Not obvious ones. Not easily exploited ones. But present nonetheless. And recognizing those points requires patience. Observation. A willingness to remain within the system long enough to see how it behaves under different conditions. Because behavior reveals structure. And structure reveals opportunity. So when she begins to act, it is not random. It is not impulsive. It is informed. Based on patterns she has already observed. Based on expectations she has already met. Based on a position she has already secured. And that preparation allows her to move with a degree of confidence that would not otherwise be possible. Not certainty. Certainty does not exist in these environments. But enough understanding to reduce risk. Enough awareness to anticipate response. Enough control to influence outcomes. At least for a time. Because time, once again, is the underlying measure. Not how something begins. Not even how it unfolds in the middle. But how long it continues before something shifts. And something always shifts. Because systems, no matter how stable, are never static. They evolve. They adjust. They respond to internal and external pressures in ways that are not always predictable, but always present. And individuals within those systems must adjust as well. Or they are adjusted for. Which is why flexibility remains essential. Not as a lack of identity. But as a recognition that no position is permanent. No alignment is fixed. No advantage lasts indefinitely. Everything changes. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes all at once. But always eventually. And those who recognize this early are better prepared when it happens. They do not assume that current stability will continue unchanged. They remain attentive. Even when nothing appears to demand it. Because they understand that change often begins before it becomes visible. That shifts occur beneath the surface before they appear above it. And that by the time something is obvious, it is often too late to respond effectively. So they watch. They listen. They adjust. Continuously. Not dramatically. But consistently. Because consistency, once again, creates stability. And stability, even temporary, provides space. Space to think. Space to act. Even for those who have already found stability. Even for those who have already secured a position that appears safe. Because safety, in these environments, is always conditional. It depends on alignment. On relevance. On the continued ability to fit within expectations that may change without warning. And when those expectations shift, everything built on them becomes uncertain. So the individuals who lasted did not assume that stability would continue unchanged. They treated it as temporary. Useful, but not guaranteed. Something to work within, but not something to rely on completely. And that mindset created a different kind of behavior. Less attachment to position. Less dependence on a single outcome. More focus on maintaining flexibility, even when things appeared secure. Because flexibility, once again, allows adjustment. And adjustment allows continuation. Which is why even in moments that appear calm, that appear settled, there is always a quiet level of attention being maintained by those who understand the system they are in. They are not relaxed in the sense of being unaware. They are steady. Alert in a way that does not draw attention. Prepared in a way that does not appear defensive. Because appearing defensive can itself create suspicion. So everything remains balanced. Calm on the surface. Attentive underneath. And this dual state, this combination of outward stability and internal awareness, is what allows someone to move through complex environments without being overwhelmed by them. Because complexity, when faced directly, can feel unpredictable. But when broken down into patterns, into repeated behaviors, into observable shifts, it becomes manageable. Not simple. But understandable enough to navigate. And navigation, at this level, is never about certainty. It is about probability. Reading situations well enough to increase the likelihood of a favorable outcome. Reducing exposure where possible. Avoiding unnecessary risks. And accepting that some level of uncertainty will always remain. Because eliminating uncertainty entirely is not possible. It can only be reduced. Managed. Anticipated. Which is why anticipation becomes such a valuable skill. Not predicting the future with accuracy, but recognizing the direction things are moving in before they fully arrive. A subtle change in tone. A difference in behavior. A shift in attention from one place to another. These signals, small as they may seem, often indicate larger changes that are still forming. And those who notice them early have time. Time to adjust. Time to prepare. Time to move if movement becomes necessary. While those who wait for clarity often find themselves responding under pressure. Because clarity, when it finally arrives, usually does so at the point where response is already required. And response under pressure limits options. It narrows decisions. It forces action that might otherwise have been avoided or handled differently. So the preference, whenever possible, is to act before pressure builds. To adjust while there is still space to do so calmly. And that preference, repeated over time, creates a pattern of behavior that appears almost effortless from the outside. Because the visible actions are minimal. The visible reactions are controlled. And most of the work happens before anything becomes noticeable. Which is why the people who navigate these systems effectively often seem unremarkable. Not because they lack ability. But because their ability is applied in ways that prevent disruption rather than create it. They smooth processes. They reduce friction. They maintain balance. And balance, in systems that are constantly shifting, is what allows continuation. Because imbalance creates movement. Movement creates attention. And attention, once again, introduces unpredictability. So balance is maintained. Carefully. Continuously. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to avoid collapse. And this applies not only to individuals, but to systems themselves. Empires balance power between regions. Courts balance influence between factions. Communities balance tradition with adaptation. And when that balance holds, things continue. When it breaks, change accelerates. Sometimes gradually. Sometimes suddenly. But always in a way that requires adjustment from everyone involved. And adjustment, once again, becomes the determining factor. Not whether change occurs. But how it is responded to. Because response shapes outcome more than the change itself. A system that adapts continues. A system that resists too rigidly often fractures. And individuals within those systems face the same choice. Adapt. Or be displaced. Not always immediately. Not always dramatically. But eventually. Because environments do not remain static long enough for rigid behavior to succeed indefinitely. Which is why the most consistent survivors are not the most resistant. They are the most responsive. Not reacting impulsively, but adjusting deliberately. Maintaining enough stability to remain grounded, while allowing enough flexibility to move when necessary. And that balance, once again, is subtle. Difficult to define precisely. But recognizable when observed over time. Because it produces results. Continuation. Presence. Longevity. Across changing conditions. Across shifting expectations. Across environments that are never entirely predictable. And that is what ties all of these worlds together. Rome. Medieval courts. Ancient rituals. The rise of individuals like Zenobia. Different settings. Different structures. Different forms of power. But the same underlying process. Observation. Adjustment. Continuation. Because no matter how complex the system becomes, no matter how powerful or structured or controlled it appears, it is still composed of individuals making decisions under pressure. And those decisions, repeated across time, shape everything that follows. Not always in ways that are immediately visible. But always in ways that accumulate. Until eventually, the system itself reflects the behavior of those within it. Reinforcing certain patterns. Discouraging others. Creating an environment where some actions feel natural, and others feel impossible. And within that environment, individuals continue to navigate. Some successfully. Some not. But all influenced by the same underlying forces. Forces that do not announce themselves. Do not demand attention. But remain present. Constantly. Shaping outcomes. Guiding behavior. Defining what is possible, and what is not. Until, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the cycle repeats. New individuals enter. New conditions form. New adjustments are made. And the process continues. Unbroken. Not because it is controlled. But because it is sustained. Through awareness. Through adaptation. Through the quiet, persistent effort to remain aligned with a world that is always changing, even when it appears still. And that, more than anything else, is what allowed people across these histories to endure. Not by mastering the world around them. But by understanding it just well enough to move through it without being undone. And that quiet understanding, the kind that never announces itself but continues shaping decisions beneath the surface, is what carries everything forward into the next moment without interruption or visible transition. Because there is no clean break between what has been understood and what is about to unfold. Only a continuation of the same process. The same careful observation. The same subtle adjustment. The same steady movement through conditions that never fully settle, even when they appear to. In ancient Rome, this continuity was everywhere. Not in grand events alone, but in the repetition of ordinary life. In the way people adapted without naming it. In the way systems shifted without declaring change. And that same continuity extended into courts, into rituals. Into the lives shaped by expectation and pressure, including figures like Zenobia, where every decision existed within a larger flow that did not pause for clarity or certainty, only for response. And even that response was rarely final. Because each action led into another condition. Another adjustment. Another moment requiring awareness. And so the movement never stopped. It only evolved. Becoming quieter. More refined. Less visible. Until it felt almost natural. Almost automatic. As if nothing deliberate was happening at all. And this is where the idea of control begins to change. Because control is not about stopping movement or fixing outcomes in place. It is about staying aligned within that movement long enough to continue. Long enough to adapt without being forced. Long enough to recognize when something is shifting before it becomes unavoidable. And that recognition does not arrive all at once. It builds gradually. Through repeated exposure to patterns that begin to feel familiar even as their details change. Through moments that seem insignificant until they repeat just enough to reveal structure beneath them. And once that structure is seen, even partially, it changes how everything is approached. Because now action is no longer isolated. It is connected. Placed within a sequence. Shaped by what has already happened and what is likely to follow. And that sense of sequence creates a different kind of patience. Not hesitation, but timing. The ability to wait without becoming passive. To observe without withdrawing. To remain present without forcing action too early. Because early action often creates resistance, while well-timed action blends into the existing flow. Reducing friction instead of increasing it. And friction, once again, is what draws attention. What disrupts balance. What forces systems to respond more aggressively than they otherwise might. So the movement continues quietly. Guided not by certainty, but by probability. By an ongoing reading of signals that suggest direction without guaranteeing outcome. By an awareness that remains active even in calm moments. Especially in calm moments. Because calm is often where shifts begin. Not loudly. Not visibly. But subtly. In tone. In behavior. In the way attention moves from one place to another without explanation. And those small movements, those almost invisible changes, are what define the next stage long before it becomes clear to everyone else. And those who notice them early do not rush. They adjust. Slightly. Carefully. Just enough to remain aligned as the environment changes around them. And that alignment allows continuation without disruption. Movement without exposure. Progress without resistance strong enough to stop it. And over time, this way of moving through the world becomes less about reacting to events and more about anticipating their shape. Not predicting them perfectly, but understanding their direction well enough to avoid being caught unprepared. And that preparation is rarely visible. It exists in choices that seem minor. In actions that seem routine. In decisions that do not stand out because they are designed not to. And this is why those who navigate complex systems effectively often appear unremarkable. Because their effectiveness lies in what does not happen. In the conflicts avoided. In the attention not drawn. In the risks reduced before they fully form. And that absence of disruption creates the illusion that nothing significant is being done. When in reality, everything is being managed continuously. Quietly. Without pause. And that quiet management is what allows systems to hold together longer than they otherwise would. Because individuals within them are constantly adjusting. Constantly reinforcing balance even as conditions change. And that balance, though never perfect, is maintained just enough to prevent collapse. Just enough to allow continuation. Just enough to carry everything forward into the next moment. And then the next. And then the next again. Without ever reaching a final point of stability. Because stability itself is temporary. Always dependent on conditions that are already beginning to shift. And so the process continues. Unbroken. Not because it is fixed, but because it is sustained through awareness that never fully relaxes. Through adaptation that never fully stops. Through a quiet persistence that does not seek control over everything, only enough understanding to move forward without being undone. And in that movement, steady and continuous, the same pattern repeats once more. Observation leading to recognition. Recognition guiding adjustment. Adjustment allowing continuation. And continuation creating the conditions for everything that follows. Again and again. Without interruption. Without conclusion. Only the ongoing flow of decisions shaping outcomes that will, in time, appear inevitable. Even though they were built from moments small enough to be overlooked. Moments that passed quietly. almost unnoticed. Except by those who were paying attention all along. And even those who were paying attention understood that attention itself was not a fixed state. It could sharpen. It could fade. It could drift if left unchecked. Because awareness, like everything else, required maintenance. It required return. A continuous coming back to the present moment, to the details that seemed too small to matter until they proved otherwise. Because what appears small is often only small in isolation. When repeated, when connected, when placed within a sequence, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a signal. And signals, once recognized, begin to change behavior. Not dramatically. But just enough. A slight hesitation where there would have been none. A pause before speaking. A decision to observe a little longer before acting. And those pauses, those small interruptions in automatic behavior, create space. Space where awareness can operate. Space where patterns can be confirmed or reconsidered. Space where action can be shaped instead of rushed. Because rushed action closes options. It commits too early. It removes the ability to adjust once new information appears. And new information always appears. Often just after a decision has been made. Which is why patience, once again, becomes less about waiting and more about positioning. Waiting not for certainty, but for clarity that is sufficient. Enough to move without forcing the outcome. Enough to act without overcommitting. Enough to remain flexible even after the decision is made. And flexibility after action is just as important as flexibility before it. Because no action exists in isolation. It creates reactions. It shifts conditions. It introduces new variables that must be observed and understood before the next step is taken. So the process does not end with action. It continues through it. Adjusting as outcomes begin to form. Refining direction as responses become visible. And this continuous adjustment is what allows movement to remain controlled even in uncertain environments. Not perfectly controlled. But guided. Directed. Influenced enough to avoid being completely shaped by external forces. And that influence, once again, is subtle. It does not force outcomes into place. It works within existing conditions. Aligning with what is already possible. Expanding it slightly. Reducing resistance where it can. Avoiding unnecessary conflict where it cannot. And over time, these small adjustments accumulate. They create pathways that feel stable. Even when the environment itself is not. Because stability, in this sense, is not about the absence of change. It is about the ability to move through change without losing direction entirely. And direction, once established, does not need to be rigid. It only needs to be consistent enough to guide decisions across shifting conditions. Because rigid direction breaks under pressure. Flexible direction adapts. It bends without collapsing. It shifts without losing its overall course. And that ability to bend is what allows continuation over long periods of time. Across different environments. Across changing expectations. Across moments where the path forward is not entirely clear. And that lack of clarity, once again, is not something to be eliminated. It is something to be managed. Accepted as part of the process. Because clarity, when it does arrive, is often temporary. It reflects current conditions. Not permanent truths. So reliance on clarity alone creates vulnerability. While reliance on awareness, on pattern recognition, on continuous adjustment, creates resilience. And resilience, once built, becomes one of the few forms of stability that can persist even when everything else shifts. Not because it resists change. But because it moves with it. Adapting continuously. Recalibrating as needed. Maintaining balance not by holding still, but by adjusting constantly. And that constant adjustment, though rarely visible, is what sustains everything. From individuals navigating daily decisions to entire systems maintaining continuity across generations. In ancient Rome, this was not something people described explicitly. It was something they lived. Something embedded in behavior. In routine. In the quiet understanding that survival depended not on controlling the world, but on reading it well enough to move within it. And that same understanding echoes through every structured environment. Through courts. Through rituals. Through the lives of those who rose carefully, including Zenobia, where each step forward depended on recognizing when movement was possible, and when stillness was the better choice. Because stillness, when used deliberately, is not inaction. It is observation. It is preparation. It is the gathering of information without drawing attention. And knowing when to remain still is just as important as knowing when to move. Because movement at the wrong time creates exposure. While stillness at the right time preserves position. And position, once preserved, allows for future movement under better conditions. So the rhythm continues. Movement. Pause. Observation. Adjustment. Then movement again. Not in a fixed pattern. But in a responsive one. Shaped by conditions as they change. Guided by awareness as it develops. And sustained by the quiet discipline of not forcing what is not yet ready to happen. Because forcing creates resistance. Resistance creates conflict. And conflict, once again, introduces unpredictability that is difficult to manage. So instead, alignment is maintained. As much as possible. For as long as possible. Until the moment shifts. And when it does, the process begins again. Observation. Recognition. Adjustment. Now, we drift into the life of Zenobia does not begin with power. It begins with position. A place within a world already structured, already moving, already shaped by forces far larger than any single individual. And from the very beginning, her life unfolds within that movement, not outside it. Because no one steps into history fully formed. They enter it gradually. Through circumstance. Through proximity. Through the quiet accumulation of influence that, at first, does not look like influence at all. She is born into the eastern regions of the Roman Empire, in or around the city of Palmyra. A place that does not sit at the center of power, but does not exist outside it either. Palmyra is something else entirely. A bridge. A meeting point. A city shaped by trade, by movement, by the constant exchange between worlds that do not fully belong to one another. Rome to the west. Persia to the east. Cultures overlapping, blending, competing, and coexisting all at once. And within that environment, awareness becomes necessary early. Because in places like this, nothing is ever entirely stable. Everything depends on balance. Zenobia grows within that balance. Surrounded by wealth, by influence, by the quiet expectations placed on those born into positions of importance. She is not raised for obscurity. She is educated. She is trained. Not only in language and culture, but in presence. In how to move within elite circles without drawing unnecessary attention. In how to listen more than she speaks. In how to observe before acting. These are not dramatic lessons. They are subtle. Repeated. Reinforced over time until they become instinct rather than effort. And those instincts matter later. Because her life changes not through sudden ambition, but through alignment with opportunity. Through marriage to Odenathus, a man who holds power not by opposing Rome, but by working within its structure. He is a client king. A ruler whose authority exists alongside Roman influence rather than against it. And through this position, Palmyra gains strength. Stability. Protection. Zenobia does not immediately become the center of this power. She exists near it. Observing it. Learning how it operates. Understanding not only what is done, but how it is done, and more importantly, when. Because timing, once again, defines everything. Then the structure shifts. Odenathus is assassinated. Not in battle. Not in some distant conflict. But abruptly. Unexpectedly. And with his death, the stability that once held Palmyra in balance begins to fracture. Because power, when tied too closely to a single individual, rarely transfers smoothly. It creates uncertainty. It creates opportunity. It creates risk. And in that moment, Zenobia does not rush. She does not declare immediate dominance. She does not force control in a way that would draw resistance. Instead, she steps into position gradually. Carefully. As regent for her young son, Babalithus. And this matters. Because it provides legitimacy. It frames her authority not as a disruption, but as a continuation. As something necessary rather than something imposed. And that framing allows movement without immediate opposition. From there, influence expands. Not dramatically at first. But steadily. Through decisions that strengthen Palmyra's independence while maintaining the appearance of alignment with Rome. Because open defiance too early would invite destruction. And Zenobia understands this. She moves within the system before she moves against it. Territories are secured. Trade routes are controlled. Influence spreads across regions that once answered more directly to Rome. Egypt. Parts of Asia Minor. Areas that matter not just politically, but economically. And with each expansion, her position becomes more defined. More visible. More difficult to ignore. But visibility introduces risk. Because Rome does not ignore shifts in power indefinitely. It tolerates them only as long as they remain within acceptable limits. And Zenobia's expansion, careful as it is, begins to cross those limits. Not suddenly. But inevitably. And when that threshold is reached, response becomes unavoidable. The Emperor Aurelian moves east. Not impulsively. Not without preparation. Because Rome, like Zenobia, understands systems. It understands timing. And when it acts, it does so with intention. The conflict that follows is not chaos. It is structure meeting structure. Strategy meeting strategy. Zenobia's forces, strong and capable, meet Roman discipline in a series of confrontations that test not only military strength, but the limits of her expansion. And for a time, she holds. For a time, the balance remains uncertain. But Rome, built on continuity and scale, applies pressure steadily. Relentlessly. And over time, that pressure reshapes the outcome. Zenobia is forced back. Her forces weaken. Her position, once expanding, begins to contract. Until finally, the movement stops. Palmyra falls. Zenobia is captured. And with that capture, her role shifts once again. From ruler to prisoner. From decision-maker to subject of another system entirely. But even here, the pattern does not break. Because her story does not end in a single moment of defeat. It continues. In Rome. Within the very structure she once challenged. And accounts differ on what follows. Some say she is executed. Others suggest she lives on, quietly, within Roman society. Not as a ruler, but not erased entirely either. And that uncertainty is fitting. Because her life, like the systems she moved within, is not defined by a single clear outcome. It is defined by progression. By adaptation. By the continuous navigation of conditions that never remained fixed long enough to guarantee stability. Zenobia did not control the world around her. She read it. She moved within it. She expanded when space allowed. She held position when pressure increased. And when the system shifted beyond her ability to influence it, she became part of it once again. Not as she was before. But not entirely removed from it either. And that is what makes her life consistent with everything that comes before and after it. Not a story of uninterrupted power, but a story of movement through power. Of awareness applied within constraint. Of decisions made within systems that were never fully hers to control. And in that sense, her life does not stand apart from the patterns already seen. It follows them. Quietly. And even after that shift, after power has moved out of her hands and into another structure, the process does not stop. Because the loss of position does not end awareness. It changes its function. It redirects it. It forces it into a quieter form, one that no longer shapes large outcomes, but still determines smaller ones. Daily ones. Immediate ones. And those decisions, though less visible, remain just as necessary. In Rome, within the vast and ordered system of the Roman Empire, Zenobia is no longer a ruler. She is no longer directing armies or expanding territories. But she is still present. Still observing. Still adapting to conditions that continue to change around her. Because even in defeat, the environment does not become simple. It remains structured. It remains layered. It remains something that must be read carefully in order to move within it without drawing unnecessary attention. And that adjustment, from visible authority to controlled presence, is not immediate. It requires recalibration. A shift in behavior. A reduction in visibility. Because what once signaled strength now signals risk. What once drew support now draws scrutiny. And understanding that difference becomes essential. So movement becomes smaller. More contained. More deliberate. Not absent. Never absent. But refined to fit the new conditions. Because survival, once again, is not about holding on to what has already been lost. It is about recognizing what remains possible and working within that space instead. And that space, though limited, still exists. Because systems rarely erase completely what they can instead absorb. And absorption, while it removes independence, allows continuation in another form. A quieter one. A less powerful one. But still a form of existence that requires awareness, that rewards restraint, that depends on understanding the boundaries that now define what can and cannot be done. And within those boundaries, Zenobia continues. Not as a symbol of expansion. But as a figure contained within a larger order. A reminder of what once was, but also an example of what happens when expansion meets its limit. And that dual role, both past and present, shapes how she is perceived, how she is treated, how closely she is observed. Because individuals who have held power are never entirely ignored, even when that power is gone. They are remembered. Watched. Measured against what they once were. Which means caution remains necessary. Because expectation still exists. Because expectation still exists. And expectation, even without authority, influences how every action is interpreted. So balance is maintained once again. Between visibility and absence. Between presence and restraint. Between memory and current reality. And maintaining that balance allows something important. Continuation. Not in the same form. Not at the same scale. But continuation nonetheless. And that continuation reinforces the same pattern that has appeared from the beginning. That survival is not tied to a single position. Not dependent on a single outcome. But shaped by the ability to adjust as conditions change, even when those changes are not chosen. Because the most difficult adjustments are not the ones made during expansion. They are the ones made after contraction. After loss. After the moment where control is no longer available in the same way. And yet, even then, the process remains the same. Observation. Recognition. Adjustment. Continuation. Applied now to a different set of constraints. A different environment. A different scale of influence. But still applied. Still active. still shaping the path forward, however narrow that path may be. And over time, that path stabilizes. Not completely. Never completely. But enough to allow routine to form again. Enough to allow predictability to return in small ways. Enough to create a structure within which daily life can continue without constant disruption. And that return to routine, even in a reduced state, carries its own kind of stability. Not the stability of power, but the stability of persistence. The ability to remain. To exist within a system that has already proven its strength. To adapt to it rather than oppose it. And in doing so, to extend one's presence beyond the moment of defeat. Because defeat, like power, is rarely absolute. It shifts conditions. It changes roles. But it does not end the process entirely. And that is what completes the arc of her life. Not a rise that continues forever. Not a fall that erases everything. But a movement through different states. From position to power. From power to resistance. From resistance to containment. From containment to continuation. Each stage shaped by the same underlying principles. The same need for awareness. The same reliance on timing. The same careful balance between action and restraint. And when viewed in that way, her life becomes less about a single dramatic narrative and more about a continuous flow through changing conditions. A sequence that does not break, even when circumstances do. A progression that remains intact, even as direction shifts. And that continuity, more than any single victory or defeat, is what defines it. Because it shows that even within systems that limit, that constrain, that absorb, there is still movement. Still adjustment. Still the possibility of navigating what remains rather than being completely undone by what has already changed. And in that quiet persistence, her story does not end. It settles. It stabilizes. It becomes part of the larger structure from which it first emerged. And from there, like everything else shaped by time and repetition, it continues forward. Quietly. Steadily. Without interruption. And within that steady continuation, something shifts again, not outwardly, not in a way that draws attention, but internally, in how time is experienced when it is no longer measured by expansion or resistance, but by duration, by persistence, by the quiet passage of days that no longer demand decisive action yet still require awareness to be maintained. Because even in stability, even in a life that has settled into a narrower structure, nothing is ever completely fixed. Conditions still change. Subtly. Gradually. Almost imperceptibly. And those changes, small as they are, still require recognition. Because when movement slows, perception often sharpens. Not out of necessity driven by pressure. But out of habit formed over years of navigating complexity. And that habit does not disappear simply because the environment has become quieter. It remains. It continues to operate. Observing patterns. Noting differences. Adjusting in ways so small they no longer feel like adjustments at all. And this creates a different relationship with time. Less urgency. But not less awareness. Because urgency fades when immediate threats are removed, but awareness remains because it has already become part of the structure of how decisions are made. And decisions, even simple ones, continue to shape outcomes, even when those outcomes are no longer historical, no longer recorded, no longer visible beyond a limited space. And in that space, contained but not erased, Zenobia continues within the framework of the Roman Empire, no longer influencing its direction, but existing within its order, adapting to its rhythms rather than attempting to alter them. And that shift, from shaping a system to moving within it, marks the final stage of her progression, not as a loss alone, but as a transformation in how agency is expressed. Because agency does not disappear when power is removed. It becomes constrained. It operates within limits. It expresses itself through smaller choices rather than larger ones. Through restraint rather than expansion. Through continuity rather than change. And those smaller choices, though rarely acknowledged, still matter. They determine comfort. They determine stability. They determine how smoothly one moves through an environment that no longer bends in response to individual will. And over time, those choices accumulate just as they did before. Creating patterns. Forming routines. Establishing a quiet structure that replaces the larger one that once existed. And within that structure, something else emerges. Not ambition. Not resistance. But clarity. A clearer understanding of the limits that define the environment. A clearer sense of what can be influenced and what cannot. And that clarity reduces friction. Because energy is no longer spent pushing against immovable conditions. It is directed instead toward what remains flexible. And that redirection creates ease. Not complete ease. Never complete. But enough to allow continuation without constant strain. Enough to allow presence without continuous conflict. Enough to let time pass without every moment requiring adjustment at the highest level of awareness. And as that ease settles, the need for constant vigilance softens. Not entirely. But gradually. Because when patterns become stable, when conditions repeat without significant disruption, the system becomes more predictable. And predictability, even in a limited form, allows attention to rest, if only slightly. But never completely. Because complete inattention invites disruption. And even in the most controlled environments, change eventually arrives. Not always dramatically. Not always with consequence large enough to alter everything. But enough to require recognition. Enough to remind that no structure remains unchanged indefinitely. And so awareness remains. Quieter now. Less urgent. But still present. Still ready to respond if conditions shift once more. And that readiness, even when rarely used, defines the final continuity of her life. Not as a series of dramatic events, but as an ongoing state of alignment with an environment that continues to exist whether she shapes it or not. And in that alignment, the earlier stages of her life do not disappear. They remain as reference. As memory. As patterns already learned and now carried forward into a quieter context. Because experience does not vanish when circumstances change. It adapts. It informs. It continues to influence how each moment is understood and approached. And that influence, though no longer visible on a large scale, remains precise. Efficient.